Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My radio device here tells me it's 6:30, so would you please, I'd call the meeting to order. Could you please stand for the singing of our national anthem? Director, would you please take the roll call?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is our roll call for our board meeting of the 8th of May, 2019. Trustee Barry.
Present.
Trustee Cram.
Present.
Trustee Danaher.
Present.
Trustee Jacobs.
Present.
Vice Chair McPherson.
Present.
Chair McAllister.
Present.
Trustee McRae.
Present.
Trustee McDonald.
Present.
Trustee Parisian.
Present.
Trustee Schooler.
Present.
Trustee Swan.
Present.
And Student Trustee Bushra-Kadra sends her regrets today, Mr. Chair. We have quorum.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. I would like a mover and a seconder, please, for the consent agenda. Moved by Trustee Barry, seconded by Trustee McDonald, that the Upper Canada District School Board approve consent agenda items 5.02 to 5.03, May 8, 2019, as submitted. Please cast your votes online, please. That motion passes. Are there any conflict of interest declarations? Seeing none, I'm going to move directly to 8.0 as there are no agenda items under unfinished business. Director?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you, I know that the Chair will have some comments about this topic as well, but I'll just try the first round to acknowledge that across Ontario it's Education Week. And while we all agree that it's Education Week every week in the Upper Canada District School Board, we know that in the province they wanted to highlight certain themes. This year's theme is Education That Works for You. And we have lots of examples of how education is working for our communities and our students and their families in the Upper Canada District School Board. This week is about highlighting system commitments that we're making throughout the school district and some local school commitments that are also shining a bright light on about how students are learning and how our staff are supporting our students. We're also taking time to recognize exemplary practice, and some trustees will know from our website that we're so excited about one of our staff receiving a provincial award this week. Ms. Lindsay Howes from Glengarry District High School. Lindsay is being recognized by the Technical Education Association in Ontario called OCTI, and for her work, her excellence in teaching. Lindsay most recently, and I know a few trustees from the table, were able to visit a skill fair that was being held at the school not so long ago. And Lindsay was the driving force behind that for grade 7 and 8 students. So we give our congratulations to Lindsay, and such a great week to have that great work being acknowledged provincially. We have many staff that would be worthy of honors like that, and we're very appreciative that the board has its own in-house recognition system. So we have our Service Excellence Awards, we have our Trustee Innovation Awards, and we have the Director's Award of Merit. And when you tally up all those nominations that we receive and the kinds of people that we see who are brought forward to be recognized through those systems, that we see we have students being very well served, and we have high caliber employees that are doing their work day in and day out to make sure that our students are successful. I also wanted to flag that this week is our Truth and Reconciliation Commission Days of Reflection and Learning, and we call it +4 because this is the 4th year since the Federal Truth and Reconciliation Commission came out with its calls for action and in 2015, and 2 specific calls for action, 62 and 63, speak specifically to the education sector. And it is a call for us to make sure that we are helping students to understand the legacy of residential schools, treaty commitments, and the relationship that we really desire between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in Canada. I've provided trustees and our staff tonight examples of a book that is being used in our system right now. There's a book club that's been organized by our Indigenous education program, looking at Speaking Our Truth, which is a wonderful book that we want to highlight for professional use and classroom use. The subtitle is A Journey of Reconciliation, and it's a bunch of narratives that speaks to the experience that Indigenous people have had in their relationship with the Crown in Canada and with non-Indigenous people in Canada. And it's a really important focal point for our students to have a conversation about some new truths and some different realities that they maybe never have heard about before. So I share that copy on behalf of the staff with our trustee table, and if you're finished reading with that, I hope that you feel inclined to pass it along to one of the schools in your ward, and they would welcome certainly an additional copy either in their libraries or in one of the classrooms. We hope that you enjoy that. So a great opportunity to celebrate all the good things that we're doing to commit to in the Upper Canada District School Board. I'm so proud of our board and the stance it's taking, and Education Week is an opportunity to shine a bright light on so many things that we do here. I'll turn that back over to you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Director. Trustees and staff, you may have noticed that I am wearing a yellow ribbon, and that yellow ribbon signifies that children's mental health matters. Mental health, if you don't mind, I'm going to read a short passage here that I found. I found it on the Canadian Mental Health Association site. Mental health is a state of well-being, and we all have it. We might have a mental illness, and we might not. Either way, we can all feel well. We can all have good mental health. It's about having a sense of purpose, strong relationships, feeling connected to our communities, knowing who we are, coping with stress, and enjoying life. And it's never too early or too late to get there. But it's not just about what you do for yourself, by yourself. Everyone needs healthy and supportive places to work, live, and learn. And that is my takeaway message for each and every one of you, and for our students, our teachers, custodians, and office administrators, EAs, and support staff, and everybody in this building. Specifically, it involves proper nutrition, a good night's sleep, plenty of exercise, focusing in the moment, which means not dwelling on mistakes, but learning from them and concentrating on the task at hand, and thereby gaining a sense of accomplishment. So, I also have, for those of you who do not have it, I have a green. I'm not sure the significance of the green, but it's the same message. Children's mental health matters. I'd like to pass one to each of you.
Do you feel that's a green one or a yellow one on your?
I'm colorblind. Is it not yellow? Is it green? Okay, I'm colorblind. Now you know for sure.
Thank you. Thanks, John.
Thank you.
They're green. Yeah. They are green. Okay. Just some are more green than others.
Different shades of green.
I think the director has alluded to several of the topics that I was going to speak on, so I won't say much more, but other than to recognize that this is Support Staff Recognition Day. And I'm sure, like you follow the schools in your ward, and you've on Facebook, for example, and you'll see, as I did, the various activities for Education Week as well as for the Support Staff Recognition Day that have occurred in each of our schools. So I find it very comforting and reassuring. So thank you. And I guess the final thing I wanted to say is that a number of us have been able to attend the three, or so, at least until now, the two Truth and Reconciliation Days. The first one being in Kemptville, and the second one being in Russell, and the third tomorrow at Drummond Public School. And I just looked at the book that the director has given to each of us, and in on the front cover, the author has stated Canada's relationship with its Indigenous people has suffered as a result of both the residential school system and the lack of understanding of the historical and current impact of those schools. Healing and repairing that relationship requires education, awareness, and increased understanding of the legacy and the impacts still being felt by survivors and their families. Young people are vital to how we move forward. Each of you, we need you. And at the Kemptville site, there were 250 students from the local schools taking knowledge from the knowledge keepers, and it was very interesting. And I'd hoped to go to Drummond tomorrow, but I don't think that's going to be possible now. So that concludes my remarks. Trustee Danaher, did you have any good news that you wanted to share?
You want a good news story?
Yes, I do.
I do have one. I have lots, but I have one. And I thought you might kind of get me tonight, John. But every school you go into, and it doesn't matter where it is, but in the Upper Canada School, there's always things that you see that just stick with you. You know, people going above, people doing different things, and for learning and for kids. And you always leave a school feeling good, at least I do. For my good news today, I chose something a little bit different though tonight, and I think I made reference to it the other night, but I want to talk about a happening that occurred 2 weeks ago at Glengarry District High School. The school put on the play Mamma Mia. I don't know if anybody's ever seen Mamma Mia, but you cannot sit in your seat and not have your legs dancing all over the place when it's going. And this was a really, really well done play. The thing that struck me the most about it, why I want to talk about it, it was all the sets were made by the tech group. The music department was there, the drama department was there, they had community volunteers, and it became a community event for the high school. Notwithstanding that the kids were phenomenal in the play. But one of the things that I loved watching all the kids working together to make this come off, and the cast of student performers, the supporters, the teachers that gave their time and made this happen, and the staff that worked hard. It became a community event, and for me it was a really good news story, and I wanted to mention it for two reasons. One, because the evening showcased itself, and I believe it again proved that small schools can provide the necessary experiences for our students. And two, I'm very fearful that given the current expectation in schools and secondaries and the government's thrusts, that we may lose these kind of things. And I want to very, very caution. It was a wonderful event, 3 straight nights, sold out every night. The community was very supportive. So the kids were great, the staff was great, the school was great, and I was very proud of them. So thank you for letting me tell that story, John.
Thank you very much, Trustee Danaher. Glengarry District High School is a great school.
Yeah.
I'm going to be moving on to 11:01, which is a report of the Policy Committee. And I'm going to turn this over to Trustee Cram.
Thank you, Chair. Policy Committee had its inaugural meeting on April 26th, 2019 at St. Lawrence Secondary School in Cornwall. Present were Trustees McDonald, Trustee Parisian, myself, Director Sliwa, and Trustee Liaison Officer Lisa Workman. The committee agreed that there should be a minimum of 4 meetings scheduled per school year to review all policies on a 2-year recycling cycle. All new policies will be developed by the Policy Committee and then presented to the Board of Trustees for ratification or amendment before implementation. We have approximately 85 policies that began in 1998 up to the current year, and we will also attempt to have them follow a consistent format with a preamble, a statement, and a reference if available. We also agreed that we'll begin to review our policies on an oldest and priority basis. Our next meeting will occur on June the 14th in Cornwall, and you have a summary that is in your handout of the policies that we'll be starting with. I'll take any questions if there are any, Chair.
Are there any questions, trustees? When do you anticipate your next report?
Sorry?
When do you anticipate your next report?
Depending on what happens on the 14th, I would suspect we should probably wait until the fall to bring back our first report. And the meeting will occur in that first term between September and November in order for us to get our 4 meetings in the year.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? I'm going to move to 11:02, which is a report of the accountability framework, and I'll ask Trustee McDonald to comment.
Thank you, Chair. So the accountability framework has met a couple times over the last month or so. Our last meeting, though, we reviewed a couple of items. And one of the things I wanted to bring to your attention is around the culture survey that Ipsos conducted for us and is going to help us with shaping the response. From a culture survey standpoint, we've done this once before, 2014, 2015. This most recent one, we had questions that were sent out, survey requirement in the fall. Right now, we are just reviewing some of the information and bringing back the report. We anticipate that report will be the first meeting in June, and we'll have a bit of a new look to it this time as well. If you were to look at the last report that was provided to the board in 2016, I think, was the report to the board, January 2016. That was our first one, so you'll see this time that you'll have some comparative data that will show the previous results to our current results. There is an attachment in your agenda, and that attachment really just shows you the timeline of how we were going to work with the response from Ipsos, or response from the culture survey, and how that gets implemented over the work that we do as a board. So if you look at the 3 different arrows there along the timeline, the blue arrows are board actions, and the green arrow is staff action and director action. So the top arrow, the accountability framework committee is reviewing the information currently. We'll report to the board our areas of emphasis and recommendations towards May and June, and then we'll use that information as well to help us frame the board work plan. After we report to the board, the director will then begin to do some work and prepare the response to those recommendations, and begin to bring reports back to the board. That'll be in the fall, and you'll see that those reports will also have status updates ongoing beyond November. Trustees as well, in the fall, will begin to see, so the bottom blue arrow right now, if you can scroll down just a little bit more. In the fall, we'll start to receive those reports. We'll receive the status reports from the director, and that'll also shape some of the work that we do around the next board plan and some of the things that we do as well when we start to review our next iteration of the strategic plan. We also, we took a look at our document. You'll see, we don't see it often, but there is a link within our agendas around the next level driven document. The next level driven document is something that was completed in 2013, I think, and really set the basis for what the accountability framework was going to do and some of the components associated to the accountability framework. And within that, we are actually starting to look at some things that have not been completed yet. And one of those things that are on there is a graduation survey. And so when the report was written, and we've had some discussions in previous accountability framework committee sessions about how would we start to look at some of these other things. So the committee talked about actually next year starting to look at survey opportunity for our grade 12 students, grade 11 and 12 potentially, and then also engage those students to have some opportunity to provide feedback after they graduate. Our mission is preparing all students for a successful life, and I think it's important that we make sure that we have a discussion with those graduating students, and let's see how prepared they were once they do graduate. So that's something that we'll be examining and looking at implementing next year, and we'll bring more information back to the board as well. By doing that, though, we would be looking at offsetting that with not doing a culture survey for our staff and all of our grade 7 to 12 students next year, but potentially the year after. One of the other pieces within the next level driven document is the school improvement plan presentations. You'll see those every meeting. We have at least 2 schools coming to present to the board. And so we started to have a discussion around has it evolved to the point where we need to look at revamping it and doing something different. We also talked about the requirements that we're going to have moving into the rest of May and into June around our budget discussions and our budget preparation. And really, in fairness to schools, we don't want that to take away from the importance. So we do know that there are 4 schools that were in the queue that we're ready to present. And I do have some recommendations that I'll read for you. We're recommending that those 4 schools that were in the queue prepare a video of that presentation, and that video be posted in the agenda as their information item, and it'll also be available for those schools to use on their sites as well. And then we would hit a pause, hard pause on school presentations until we have an opportunity to review in the fall what that might look like in the future. So 2 recommendations are hitting that pause button, and the other one is to allow for the 4 schools that are in the queue to have a videotape presentation and part of our agenda for the next couple of meetings into the end of the school year. So if I may, Chair, may I read those recommendations? The school improvement presentations are paused for the remaining part of the operational year and subject to further dialogue about the focus and format of such presentations, and that the committee recommends that the 4 schools that are currently preparing 4 presentations be provided with an opportunity to create a video report that will be attached to future board meeting agendas under information reports. And in doing so, the committee believes that the board will be honoring staff efforts to date to trial this format for a purpose of feedback from trustees and school principals. So I'd be happy to move that, Mr. Chair.
A question for you, Trustee McDonald. Do you want these motions dealt with separately or together?
We can put them together because it is germane. They're in relation. We're going to hit pause except for those 4.
Okay. I'm going to read the motion there now. That the school improvement plan for student achievement and wellness, SIPSAW, presentations are paused for the remaining part of the operational year and subject to further dialogue about the focus and format of such presentations, and that the committee recommends that the 4 schools that are currently preparing for presentations be provided with an opportunity to create a video report that will be attached to the future board meeting agendas under information reports. In so doing, the committee believes that the board will be honoring staff efforts to date and to trial this format for the purposes of feedback from trustees and school principals. I would entertain a mover, please. Trustee McDonald and a seconder. Trustee Cram. Any discussion? Trustee McPherson.
Just, I guess, schematics. In making the video, do we have the technology in the various schools, or will it require support from the communications department?
Director?
Mr. Chair, through you, we'll be using our central staff resources to support those 4 schools. We already do dedicate those resources in preparation for their face-to-face presentation. So it'll simply be adding some other personnel to support the videotaping and the posting of the material.
Thank you.
Any further questions? There being none, would you cast your vote, please? Hasn't come up on mine yet. Why don't we take a vote? Hands up, please. All in favor, opposed? Carried. Trustee McDonald, you've made good progress on this, and I appreciate your work on this committee. It's vital and critical to the development of our strategic plan, and frankly, it does accentuate the importance of the role of the trustee, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
12.01. Director, will I turn this over to you to begin?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you, ladies and gentlemen, we are presenting to the board this evening the next presentation in a series of presentations to support the board in engaging in a vigorous 2019-2020 budget deliberation and the development of a budget for the next operational year. You may recall that Mr. Richard, who's with us this evening, did a presentation in a previous meeting not so long ago that gave a provincial overview about how school boards are funded. And tonight's presentation is more focused with the release of the Grant for Student Needs on April 26th that will provide some general ideas about projected funding, and highlighting, Mr. Chair, the word projected, that we are expecting to receive from the Ministry of Education pending some other adjustments and confirmation of our enrollments. So I'll turn it over to Mr. Richard, Mr. Chair, and we'll proceed from there.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's a pleasure to be here this evening. As the director pointed out, the intent is to give the Board of Trustees a brief overview of the recently released Grants for Student Needs, affectionately known as GSN, and just to provide the Board with some highlights as you begin the process of budget deliberations. So if we look at the first slide, we thought it would be important to show trustees in terms of the timing of the release of information from the ministry, and how this year it certainly cramps the process in terms of how late it's coming out. And the idea, once again, is to give you a brief sort of overview of the last 3 or 4 years of when the information has come out regarding the Grants for Student Needs, or GSNs. You'll see in 16-17, if we use it as a base year, it was a typical year where the actual announcement of the GSNs came in and around March 24th, with a few weeks later the release of the actual budget forms and the technical paper. And at that point, there were no labor extension agreements. They didn't come into effect till 17-18, 18-19. 17-18, there was a bit of a delay compared to a regular year, and that was because of the negotiations of those extension agreements. Took a little more time, and then that information had to be brought together before it was released to school boards. And then we moved forward to 18-19, a more typical year again, March 26th. With the forms coming later in the next month. And then, of course, the extension agreements, it was year 2 of 2. And so here we are in 1920, and we don't receive the actual announcement of the grants until April 26th. And then we are hoping and expect to get the technical paper, hopefully Friday, but we never know until we actually get it. And so, Mr. Chair, the idea of the impact shows you the delay in calculating revenue. When it typically comes out in mid to the third week in March, it provides more ample time for staff to do the calculations, start bringing the information, and then the Board of Trustees has ample times to discuss. It certainly squeezes the process down when they're coming a month later in terms of the information. And here we are mid-May and we still don't have the forms. And so that's why you're going to hear a lot, and the director pointed it out, and I'm going to be showing a slide in a few minutes that tells you that, you know, a lot of caveats and assumptions. We have to wait till we get the forms. We got to wait. We do have some information that certainly gives you some information with respect to the changes in some of the funding specifications. But once again, I'm sure you hear it every year from the finance staff, and that is that until we actually get the forms, we can't give you the totally specific numbers, although, you know, we're certainly close in terms of the quantum. If we look at the next slide, those notes and assumptions that I'm sure you see each year, but it's worthwhile just taking a minute to go over those. And so all of our references and analysis based to date, and you're going to see tonight, is based on the release of that GSN memorandum, which occurred on Friday, April 26th. And so the following estimates are simply initial projections based on that information received. And of course, as we mentioned a couple times, we're awaiting the 1920 technical paper. And then even more important are the actual EFS computerized forms where we actually put in the data for Upper Canada. And then we get specific information. Initial estimates, as the director pointed out, are based on enrollment projections received from the planning department in early April. And of course, in the end, it's always updated with actual figures in September and November and whatnot. So if we start to look at some of the specific impacts with respect to the highlights for GSN announcement, you'll see there projected impacts of class size changes. That seems to be the big change that everyone's talking to across the province right now. You'll see in kindergarten, the class size, the funding for class size has remained unchanged. It's the same. They didn't tinker with kindergarten. However, they did make a major change to the early childhood education funding model. And basically what it is that whatever the formula that the ministry used, they actually gave a bit of a top-up to school boards. And our understanding is when they initiated junior kindergarten and implemented the early childhood educators, they actually thought that boards were going to run the programs themselves, and therefore they thought we should just give you a little extra so you can carry forward with the ECEs flowing right from the classroom into the board regulated or operated after-school program. But of course, as many of the trustees would know, that's not what happened. Almost all boards in the province use third parties to run those after-school programs, and for very valid reasons, obviously. I didn't want to get into the actual business of operating after-school programs. And so the ministry knows that, and what they said this year is we're going to take back that little incremental funding from school boards because you're not really using it for our intent. And for this board, Upper Canada, it's $925,000 plus reduction in board funding. Now, a little bit of good news in tandem with that is boards have been telling the Ministry of Education for years now that there simply isn't enough money in there to cover the supply costs for ECEs when they're off on sick leave or whatever. And so they listened, and they actually are upping the amount of money that's being allocated for supply costs for ECEs. And in that new formula, it's just over $286,000 in additional funding that will flow into the board to assist with that cost. We look at the intermediate grades 4 to 8, the funded average class size. They're not changing the actual class size from the 24.5, but not unlike the ECE funding, there was just a little bit of additional funding where they were actually funding based on a model of 23.84, even though the class size limit was set at 24.5. That results in a reduction for Upper Canada of $1.2 million in board funding. And then, of course, the big one, secondary grades 9 to 12, which was their main focus during the analysis of the GSNs for school boards. And so they are moving the funded average class size from 22 to 1 to 28. Of course, staff across the province have been wondering how they were actually going to do that, and so that's why we were greatly anticipating the actual release of the GSNs. Basically, they had probably two models that they could move forward with. One was using approximately a quarter of the change each year and coming up with an approximation for that. What they've decided is the second model, which is making the entire change from 22 to 28, and basically for the Upper Canada District School Board, it means a reduction in board funding of approximately $10 million because of that change from 22 to 28. Now, it obviously is a big number, but trustees will no doubt recall that the government has gone to great pains to make announcements on a regular basis to the public that they are instituting a new grant called attrition protection. The idea being that no teacher will lose their position because of this change. And the idea going forward over the next 4 years is that you will move to the 28 class size number through retirements, teachers that go on leave or that leave for other reasons such as being seconded into the board office or something. And so what they're doing is they're funding top up the school boards where the change in the funded classroom teachers exceeds the actual attrition and voluntary leaves. And so based on our approximations this year, as best as we can gather in terms of what the number of retirements and leaves based on historical data might be, that would result in a grant coming back into the board of $6.5 million. And so really, Mr. Chair, what you're looking at is the difference in the two numbers, and that would be approximately, at this point in time, based on our best estimates, $3.5 million. And so it's not the 10 million number that people are seeing and thinking, how do we handle that? It truly is the difference, and so we're looking, once again, at approximately $3.5 million for that one item. Still a large number, but a lot better than the 10 million number. Some of the additional impacts resulting from class size, we often think of class size changing, and obviously that means teachers in the classroom. Well, there are other secondary impacts. One in this particular case here is that the government was providing a special grant called secondary programming funding. They are ending that funding effective September 2019, and that was a grant that the government was allocating to school boards mainly to beef up the number of student success teachers throughout the system. And so they are eliminating that grant, and it won't be in place for next year. And probably one of the biggest secondary impacts of the class size change, of course, is school operations allocation. Because although they're saying it'll take 4 to 5 years to get to the 22 to 28, the government doesn't always reflect that gradual rate in terms of looking at school operations. So of course they say you don't need as much space as you did last year because you don't have 22 to 1. You need less classrooms because you're at 28 to 1 average, and so if you don't need those classrooms, you don't need to clean them, you don't need to, but of course we all know that those changes can't be made that quickly. However, they do institute those changes into the grant calculations, and so based on the anticipated declining enrollment change for next year, as well as reflecting the new secondary class size, at this point in time, before we get the actual forms in that, we're estimating just over $600,000 in reduction in board funding for school operations. And then, of course, one of the other big concerns for Upper Canada District School Board has been, no doubt, the student transportation issue over the last couple of years. And we've all waited with bated breath for the announcement of the GSNs, and this is truly a good news item. Certainly, the Ministry of Education has listened to all of the comments put forward by not only Upper Canada, but obviously those other boards in the province that were facing deficits in 17-18 or 18-19, depending on the specific circumstances in those boards. And so the good news is that going into 1920, the Ministry of Education is going to 100% fund any deficit coming in from 18-19. So whatever that happens to be in 18-19, right now their projections are based on the revised estimates that the board sent in last November, or rather December, based on your new information on the specific enrollment at the end of November and whatnot. And so they are going to make another change when the board submits its financial statements at mid-November to the end of November. They'll pick that exact number of your 18-19 deficit, and they will fully fund that in 19-20. So that's great news. So, yet to be determined how that'll end up in the end, but that'll be a number that you don't have to deal with in the 19-20 budget deliberations. At this point in time, that does not speak to the issue that Upper Canada still dealt with 17-18 with a deficit in 18-19, and those discussions are carrying on at this time. International Student Recovery Amount is a brand new item for 19-20. Oddly enough, the colleges in the province have been dealing with this for a number of years and have been experiencing this. This is the first year for the K-12 sector. And what it is for every full ADE, average daily enrollment, of international students in the board, the ministry is going to take back $1,300 per student. And so you'll see, based on the estimate right now, based on projected enrollment, that would be a loss in grant of $347,100. And according to the ministry, certainly in questions that came up subsequent to the release, they've stated that the main purpose for that is because of the capital requirements, the additional capital requirements required to house those students and whatnot that they don't get back because they're coming internationally. And so that is certainly, whether that's right or wrong, that's the answer we're being given when we question them about why they'd be taking that back. Other specific grants, Mr. Chair, that they are looking at reducing for next year, the Local Priorities Fund, those trustees that were on the board prior to, at the last set, will remember that the Local Priorities Fund was 2017-19. All of the specific union groups in the education field were obviously negotiating with the provincial government centrally, and they all made specific deals in the end that required funding of specific proposals. So every union had different demands. And so based on that, the boards were required to take those deals into place and actually implement and action those plans. And to subsidize the cost of those agreements, Upper Canada Board was funded to the tune of just over $3.6 million. What the government is saying at this point is that funding ended officially on August 31st, 2019. They are very careful in the announcement to say negotiations are going to begin now in May with those groups again, and so obviously they're not saying whether that would come back in, but they're going to wait until those negotiations are complete, and then obviously we would receive supplementary information. But as at this time, they're assuming, as per the agreement, that the funding ends August 31st. So certainly what that means is you begin deliberations for your budget, you're to assume there is no funding in that area. Another specific grant that the board was getting, and all boards in the province were receiving, was the cost adjustment allocation. That was a supplementary grant that all boards got, and it goes quite a ways back actually in history. And what it was boards of education were continually going to the ministry because they were providing us with these funding model table saying for certain education worker, this is how much you get, this is how much the benefits you're getting. And so boards were able to show over a number of years, you're not giving us enough money to do that. The benefits are actually higher than you're showing in your table. The salaries not, the average salaries are higher. So they actually listened to boards for a number of years and then instituted a special grant that was put there to assist boards in maybe closing that gap. They are now saying that they are ending that funding, and I believe the statement was something to the effect that there are other areas in the GSN that boards have available that they can make that work. Human Resource Transition Supplement. That was a special funding, Mr. Chair, allocation to assist boards in managing the 2017-19 Central Collective Agreement. As I mentioned, there were several different unions. They all had different deals, and so there was created quite a bit of extra work for especially human resource departments and school boards, and so there was a bit of additional funding to help perhaps with maybe adding a staff or two to help implement and action those agreements. That funding, once again, is ending, coinciding with the ending of the $3.6 million related to those extension agreements. Mr. Chair, those are the main grants in the GSNs, and certainly just a quick brief overview. Each board in the province over the last many years would have also relieved outside of the regular GSN additional specific grants to help with what the government would call its own priorities. They were formerly known as EPOs. I'm sure you've heard the term Education Program Other. The new government has decided to do away with that name. They've come up with their own, and it's called the Priorities and Partnership Fund, or PPF. And basically, what they state basically is their approach. Of course, you've heard about the new vision for education and aligning the budget with their priorities. And certainly that's what the intent is here, is to provide funding for specific priorities that the government feels are important, that directly support students in the classroom. And before I start to go through the number here is, I think it's important to note that when you see the numbers on the right-hand column, it's very important to note that it's a provincial allocation and not a board-specific. And so you have to take into account that those amounts, 2.25 million seems like a rather large number, that's for the entire province. And if we put in perspective, Upper Canada based on its enrollment, and if we're only looking at enrollment and trying to compare across the province, we're what we used to always term Upper Canada would be a 1.29% board. In Limestone over my career, it was always easy because we were a 1% board, so it was easy. And the idea being, if 2.25 million is for the province, and they base the distribution based solely on enrollment, you would expect to get 1.29% of the 2.5 million, which would be approximately $29,000 and something dollars or so. And so you can see there, we're not talking huge amounts of money. And so as we start to go through there, if you look at the curriculum implementation there, that funding is to support the implementation of recently released curriculum. And so we're all aware of the elementary health and physical education and the revised grade 10 career studies as an example. The funding is in addition to any funding that was announced recently about the Indigenous and adding those courses. This is not involved in here. If we look at the engaging parent and communities, those grants will support students in identifying barriers and opportunities to strengthen parent engagement in their own communities. The French language education grant, Mr. Chair, does not apply to, it's only for French language boards, and so it doesn't apply to public boards. If we look at the Indigenous education, obviously it's programs and supports to assist Indigenous learners to graduate, support successful transition into secondary schools or the labor market, inclusive school environments and innovation. And Mr. Chair, I should probably just stop and say, this is the kind of brief overview that the ministry gives at this time. But what happens is, subsequent to all these announcements, and there's probably more PPFs to come, the board will receive what's called transfer payment agreements, which delineate much more clearly what the purpose of the grants are, what they're to be used for, the reporting requirements and whatnot. And they'll be sending one for each of the grants. They might group a couple into one TPA or transfer payment agreement, but there will be one for each one that clearly delineates what those grants are to be used for. If we look at math, you can see is one of the bigger numbers, and of course you know that is one of their big initiatives for 1920. We all know the reasons for it and the reasons they put out for that. but it allows boards to support and implement the revised math curriculum and coordinate board improvement efforts in mathematics. Mental health and well-being, funding to support school boards and authorities to meet local needs and priorities that promote well-being and mental health, including safe, healthy, inclusive, and accepting learning environments. And then special education. Mainly, a good chunk of that money will go towards after-school skills development program that's provided to all school boards to support students with autism spectrum disorder in social communication, self-regulation, and life planning, and we know that is a very definite priority right now in the province. If we then move to the last few, we got student pathways, and that will be obviously to support students, the main focus being the specialist high skill major support to students to focus on a career path that matches their skills and interests while meeting the requirements of the Ontario Secondary School diploma. The supporting student potential is a focus on youth programs to create summer employment opportunities for high school students who may be disengaged from school and or experience barriers to employment. And then finally, Mr. Chair, the system support inefficiencies is an interesting one. It's actually money that the government's going to put through to school boards, and the main purpose of that is the broadband modernization program. So funding's provided to provide access to reliable, fast, secure, and affordable internet services to all students and educators in all regions across Ontario, including rural and northern communities. And so also, as part of that plan, the ministry will work jointly with boards to strengthen cyber protection measures, which you'll like. Mr. Chair, that is a brief overview of the actual major grants and the proposed changes for 2019-20, as well as the first set of PPFs or priority and partnership funding specific grants that are coming to the boards. Finally, we're just providing a brief overview of the 1920 budget presentation timelines based on what has already come to the board and what we see at this time. Of course, as trustees can appreciate, Mr. Chair, it's flexible. We get new information almost daily, and so this can vary sometimes from day to day. But April 24th, trustees will recall that we did a presentation, a review of education funding and expenses, just generally, as well as some provincial budget highlights at the time. You'll see tonight the GSN highlights, and then we'll be doing a brief planning session and orientation on the GSNs. Next week, we hope to come back with some updated revenue and budget considerations for the board. May 21st, SEAC meeting to look at the GSN highlights and the special education revenue projection. We should have the forms by then in the technical paper, we anticipate, so we'll be able to give some pretty specific information. May 29th, continuation of those budget deliberations. June 4th, SEAC with updated revenue, expenses, and considerations. June 5th, back to the board using in Upper Canada what you would know as the traditional number format, ending, hopefully, depending if we have all the information and the board has had full consideration of those budget components, proposed budget for approval. Mr. Chair, I'd be glad to try and respond to any questions trustees have.
Thank you, Mr. Richard. Trustees, do you have any questions? Trustee McRae.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. What was that ratio again? You said it was 1 for the limestone. What's the ratio for the upper?
Oh, I'm sorry.
No,
in limestone, our number of students that we had, our enrollment.
No, the percentage that we as a board can expect to get from the total provincial. You mentioned a ratio, 1 point something or other, and I just want you to tell me again.
1.29. If we take the enrollment of Upper Canada and we compare it to the total enrollment across the province, you're 1.29% of the total enrollment across the province. In Limestone, we were almost exactly 1%, so it made it really easy to do the numbers.
Well, I could remember the one, it was
Yeah,
1.29.
it was
That kind of
1.29.
escaped me.
Yes.
Thank you.
That, and Mr. Chair, I should confirm, through you to the trustee, that supposes that the allocation of the grant, which does occur sometimes, is based totally on enrollment. You get your 1.29%. Sometimes they put it out, but there could be variations across the boards because you have, proof that you have particular more demand for whatever it is, and you could actually get more than your 1.29. But in general, that's the way they put it out.
Director and then Trustee Barry.
Mr. Chair, through you, just one particular footnote to that comment from Mr. Richard was the Priorities and Partnership Fund, formerly the EPO grants. One of the trends that we see now is moving away from the Board of Education getting its percentage based on the overall numbers in the province, so our 1.29%, to now a application process for some of these grants. And before, it was given to the board based on that percentage and then with the strict parameters outlined in the transfer payment agreement. It's a very interesting development because what that means is that there is not an assumption with some of those grants being flowed to the board that the board has an immediate need, an immediate interest, a capacity to be built around a specific objective that's there. And so that's something that our senior team will need to work with our finance people about, because some have gone in that direction, application-based, others have not in the more traditional format of that, giving us a block grant based on our percentage enrollment given the province.
Thank you. Trustee Barry.
Okay, so projections, where does it get tied to enrollment? There didn't seem to be any figures on enrollment, Mr. Chair. I would think that, I'd like to try to understand where are we up in projected enrollment? Are we down? And if we're down, how far are we down? And that enrollment's got to have some kind of an impact at some point.
Director?
Mr. Chair, through you, that's quite correct. These are student-driven grants, so our enrollment is a key characteristic in influencing how we may be allocated dollars. In other instances, the budget uses a ratio of, for instance, one staff person per 1,000 students. Another way of looking at allocating funds, not just based on enrollment in general, but based on specific increments. Mr. Chair, the board will recall that there was a enrollment report that came from Mr. Dawes in January where we provided some figures regarding projections, and it would be standing the board well as part of the landing page reports that come with some future presentations to the board, that we would refresh what those projections were so people have that in mind as the dialogue unfolds.
Does that answer your question, Trustee Barry?
Quite frankly, I didn't get it. Where does when is enrollment going to impact these figures? Are we down in enrollment? Where does it come in?
Okay, we'll try and take another stab at this. Director?
So, Mr. Chair, through you, a second run at this is that, as the board knows, we have enrollment snapshots throughout the year. We have a March projection, we have a October projection, and then we have another March projection. So, and I'll ask Mr. Dawes if he could comment in a moment about the specifics about where our projection rests compared to this year, which I think is really what the question is from the table.
Projected? Yeah.
So I'll turn it over to Mr. Dawes for a moment.
Mr. Dawes?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. As a way of an introduction to this, the board will recall we had a number of years where we had quite significant enrollment decline in keeping with other boards across the province. Our general demographics now show that has evened out, so the impact of enrollment decline is not certainly as severe as it used to be. Generally speaking, our system enrollments that are used for generating our projections show an elementary decline of about 14 and secondary
194 for next year. So just over 200
altogether.
Okay, that's, Mr. Chair, may I
Very
comment?
reasonable.
That's
Yes.
what I was driving at.
Okay,
Yes.
thank you. I'm glad you're You got your answer? Trustee McDonald?
Thank you. I want to add to that quickly, and then I ask my questions. I think it's important to note that the funds are based on the numbers we provide to the government.
Correct.
And those estimates that we provide are at those timelines that the director indicated. So that's how this money is determined. How it actually gets played out is whenever the technical paper comes in those computerized forms. That's how we know where it comes. From our projection standpoint, we get funding now, and then we do revised estimates in October, what our actual students are in bums and seats in September. So generally, we're less than 1%.
Very close around that. And adding to that, Mr. Chair, if I could, trustees may recall in our presentation back earlier in the winter, the definition around ADE, average daily enrollment, is the calculation of October enrollments and March enrollments. So that's why trustees are continuing to see updates, because we're still putting together the March 31st enrollment figures that will finalize the ADE overall for the overall school year. Okay.
Trustee McDonald, you have a question
My
now?
question is, on slide or page, where it talks about the attrition rate, I don't know what page that is. 4? The attrition protection piece, was that $6 million, that's a calculation that we did based on the B memo for us to figure out who was in the different categories? Has that funding been allocated, or is that just our estimate of what we're going to get?
That's our estimate of what we think we're going to get, Mr. Chair, based on an initial projection of how many retirements we might be looking at, as well as leaves. Because you recall I stated at the start that that's how they're going to calculate how much grant the board loses based on retirements and whatnot. So if you assume around 35 at 100,000, when the ministry does its calculations, it uses 100,000 to round off. That's 3.5 million. And so that's what we have. They are going to use the number we give them. Just as Mr. Chair, Trustee McDonald said about when we're doing general enrollments, he's correct. We start initially, and then we back it up with actual figures later. Well, we're not going to know about retirements and everything in the end until the first day in September, when everybody shows up. And so we have to put a number in. So we go back 3-4 years, we look on average how many retired, how many went on leave, and we came up with 35. And so that's where the 3.5 million comes right now.
Follow-up?
Yes, Bob.
So if we take that fund away, right, or the estimate associated to it, and we look at just the GSN announcement that was provided, and we understand that the ministry has indicated that around transportation there was a 4% increase, I think, to all boards.
Yes.
And that there was also built in a 1% increase for some staff allocations, some salary increases. Those were also built into what the GSNs say. Mm-hmm. If I just look at the GSNs that were announced, without taking the extra, we're actually up 0.25%. Okay, so if you follow my math for a second, we've got an additional $800,000 roughly.
No, it's a reduction.
Overall, we got an extra $800,000 when I do the calculations, roughly. So we have extra money in transportation to offset what our expenses are, but it also includes the 4% that everybody else got.
Correct.
So it's not really completely covering it, or I guess it's an estimate, it's $1 for $1. But what we got for transportation, we lost elsewhere. We didn't get any increase in overall funding, not a huge increase anyway.
That's correct.
So although it looks like a great, save for us on transportation, my concern is that we've got an increase in transportation, but we've got a significant decrease everywhere else. And so we know that we're carrying $4 million into 2019-20. How, when we look at this and we run the numbers roughly, what's the biggest impact, other than that attrition piece? What's the other area that has the biggest impact for us as far as a reduction goes?
Mr. Chair, through you to try and respond. Basically, I think there are a couple, obviously the attrition is a major positive, but only in relation to the even larger negative. The biggest impact has got to be the adjustment of the class size from 22 to 28. And what it does do by the government modeling it this way, it does show you that huge impact over the 4 years of $10 million. And of course, they're back ending it with the 6.5 million. But then what happens is, in terms of large size, there's nothing really that big other than that. But when you start adding $1 million for the ECEs, $1 million for intermediate, $1 million under another, it doesn't take long to get $3-4 million, and you'll see that it starts to add up quite quickly. And so if we hadn't got that transportation, and Mr. Chair, I just will point out to Trustee McDonald, he's very right about the 4%. When we looked at the board-by-board projections from the ministry, when you first looked at it, you thought, wow, that's a really big increase in the funding. But you had to back out the 4% first, and then when you looked at the difference, it almost exactly matched what we put in for our revised estimates that we thought our deficit would be for 18-19. So it proved that they are matching it 100%. If at the end of the year, as part of the financial statements, that number is actually bigger, they will pay that. So it's 100% coverage. So, and Trustee McDonald's absolutely right. It doesn't help with 18-19 specifically and 17-18. But if they hadn't done that, you'd be looking to find another $5 million in the budget going forward.
Trustee McRae?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On that same slide, the change in the ECE staffing ratio, would you help me to understand that?
Yes.
What changes are, what they are, and what changes, how the impact is?
Mr. Chair, probably the best way to try and respond is whatever formula that the ministry used, and if you go into the table charts, I was checking it today, and they say per 1,000 students of junior kindergarten, we give you 44.76 ECEs. What they did, and so you assume that's 1-to-1, and they do that. And you'll recall earlier I gave a little explanation. At the time when they instituted, you remember I said the ministry thought, you know what? They're going to have to flow that ECE and carry on into the after-school program because we believe the boards are going to run those programs. And so they put a little factor of 14% on. So it was 1.14. For every one they thought you needed to make it work in the classrooms, they gave you a little bump up of 14% in funding to allow you to fund to carry on those ECEs to go into the after-school program. Well, as I mentioned, I don't know of any board in the province who actually decided to run them themselves with their own staff. They went third party and had them run it. So they deal with all the human resources issues, the pay, and all that. And so the ministry knew that. And so that's what they're using as justification to say, wait a minute, we're going back to 1-to-1. We're not going to give you that little 14% bump up in funding that you can then use for what you want. So that's what they've done.
So this is not impacting the classroom, or the schoolroom, the daycare place, or like what is the ratio?
Mr. Chair, that's a very good point. And as we come, at a further meeting, we'll be able to explain to you what that impact is in terms. Absolutely, the final intent and goal is not to impact the classroom, or if you do, minimize it as much as you can. But certainly, there is potential there not to impact the classroom terribly, yes.
Through you, Chair.
Trustee Swan?
Okay, so all is well. We can get our students to school, and they've increased the busing, so we don't seem to have as much of a deficit. But it seems like there's a lot of reductions in the GSNs in regards to in the classroom and the increase in class sizes. And I'm just wondering, when will we as a board be getting more information on how these reductions, I know we have to pass our budget as trustees, but what the board, when are we going to get the information on what the board is going to propose in regards to how many courses are we going to have to get rid of? How is this going to impact our small schools? When are we going to get have this conversation?
Director?
Mr. Chair, through you, trustees will see on slide 10 the timeline that Mr. Richard gave an overview to, and the specifics of starting to provide information about impact options, which we know the board is looking forward to in order to make informed choices about how to proceed for the next operational year, really begins in earnest next Wednesday on May 15th. And again, on May 29th, another deliberation of the budget. And then if we continue on, June 5th and June 19th are subsequent opportunities. I know that the chair had mentioned at the end of April the prospect of having to tap alternating Wednesdays for special board meetings, and we were asked as a staff to hold that, and I know that the board was asked also to be aware of that request forthcoming. So I hope that helps to provide some clarity about when some greater specifics will come, because at that point staff will have had looked at the ministry software, plugged in the numbers, and be able to come back with some clarity in terms of what are the key considerations and choices that the board will start to entertain.
The secondary, please.
Yes, Trustee Swan?
So when will our students know if the courses they've selected, or secondary students know if the courses they've selected for next year, for September, are even going to be available? Is it going to be when they're entering exams?
Director?
Mr. Chair, through you, course selection is what it is every year, and this is no different this given year, which is students will select courses, and based on enrollments, the course may or may not occur. Many times secondary school principals will remind us that students are really in the driver's seat in terms of which courses proceed and which don't, because of the enrollment that allows us to offer the course versus not offering the course during the day school and maybe doing it through continuing education or e-learning instead. I want to assure the board that this is no different than any other year with respect to course selection, and we understand that we have collective agreement commitments that will require us to staff schools as we've agreed to going forward for September of 2019. So I don't think that that's a concern that the board needs to entertain at this time.
Are there any other questions? I think it's pretty obvious that the reason the presentation was called GSN Light is because it's light on specifics, and it's a brief overview. We have yet to receive specific allocations, and details will follow with the technical paper. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think if there being no further questions, I'm going to move on to item 1601, because 13.0, other business, there were no items. 14.0 was a report to the board from private session, which never occurred. 15.0 action items, there were no action items, and there were no non-action items. So you have the notice of motion request to amend the bylaws. What do I need to do here, Director? Anything in particular?
Nothing at this time, Mr.
That's
Chair.
information.
Forthcoming at a future meeting.
The rest, there is no private session. We will be adjourning this meeting into a planning session, and we, Management Council, made the decision to keep this regular session of the board meeting as light as possible. It's another light, because we are going to be dealing with two very specific items with regard to special education and the budget considerations and staff preparations. So, can I have a motion to adjourn? Trustee McPherson? Seconder? Trustee Barry? All in favor? None opposed? Motion's carried. We will now be moving into a planning session.
Brief recess,
Would
Mr.
you
Chair.
like a brief recess? 10 minutes? Here. 5 to 2? Okay. I'd appreciate it if you could be back. Thank you.